Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today we're going to be talking on something about something called alchemical evolution. All right, we're going to talk about this idea of these building blocks, about trying to get something more and more complex. All right, so we're thinking about the hierarchy of life. We're trying to start to think about how could life come to be on this planet from non-living things. Whether it's the table or you, we are still made up of the same things. How does that start to come together to create something that could be living? All right. And there's lots of different theories out there about how this is. And we're just going to kind of touch on one of the predominant theories about how life could have started on this planet, with the idea of how could have life come about billions and billions of years ago from non-living ingredients. All right, so we're talking about that organization of life, the hierarchy of life, where we talk about atoms and molecules and macromolecules and organelles. We're going to talk about cells. We're not going to get all the way up to cells today. We're not going to talk about that yet. We're going to talk all the way from atoms up to macromolecules, because those macromolecules are the necessary things that we find in all living organisms. All living organisms have macromolecules. All right, and so we're going to talk a little bit about this process of chemical evolution. Now, we're going to do this two different ways, because we're talking about chemical evolution. We're going to talk about it in terms of like kind of a chemistry, since we're dealing with atoms and molecules. I'm going to talk about it right here on this board, kind of more of a general term. And then I'm going to come over here and we're going to switch the camera. And we're going to come all the way over here. And we're going to talk about it from more of a specific biological term, the actual macromolecules and the things that make them up. And then going forward, you're going to learn a little bit more about which type of macromolecules there are. So we're going to do this very, very basic here, kind of talk about the chemistry, bring up some kind of vocabulary here, and then we'll talk about it from a little bit more specific standpoint. So you guys should have out your handy-dandy notebooks. And now, again, this is another one. This is a really good example of one of those times that if I write a word on the board, I might not write the definition directly on the board. This is a video. You can pause it. If I describe it or define it, but don't necessarily write on the board, don't just watch this video and wait for me to write something. All right? If I write something and then I start talking about it, pause the video or even go back in the video and write what I talked about in that class. Because if you look back at this later and you see polymer or, dehydration synthesis, which is a word I'll use over there, you write that down in your notebook, but you don't define it in 2 days. Are you going to know what that is? So make sure you're supplementing and annotating your own notes based on this video here. So let's get back to it. All right, so we're going to talk about kind of the basic building blocks. So we know that all matter in the universe is basically made up of a fundamental principle. There are parts that make up these things, but they are atoms. They are the basic unit of all matter. I'm just going to draw them real simple. There's different types of atoms based on the number of protons, neutrons, electrons. I'm just going to draw them as little tiny circles for right now, just to make, we're doing this kind of a broad, big picture here. All right. So we'll do 3 of them or what we're going to be doing here. No, we'll do 4. So I have my atoms here. All right. We believe that as the Earth started to form and it was extremely hot in its early formation, it was made up of all matter. So we got this concoction of different elements. But as it started to cool down and things became a little bit more stable on primitive Earth, here we could start to form, we could start getting kind of connections between these different atoms, all right? So we have our different atoms here, and they start to form relationships, if you will, with the atoms around it using their electrons, their valence electrons. Let's think back to physical science. We talked about covalent bonding. All right, the sharing of electrons. All right, and so we start forming different. We start getting covalent bonds here. So maybe, all right, they start sharing electrons, and all of a sudden here we've taken atoms and we've formed something different. We've created molecules. All right, by sharing those. So we took some simple building blocks and we made it a little bit more complex. Still very small molecules. We're talking things like water, H2O, carbon dioxide, CO2, that's 1 carbon, 2 oxygens, water's 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, methane, CH3 or CH4, still very small things. I'm going to use these instead of drawing these each time. I'm going to draw it with like a triangle, a little m per molecule. All right. So once we start building our molecules here, all right, we have our molecule. Then these molecules start interacting with other molecules. Water molecules start interacting with other water molecules, or water interacting with carbon dioxide, or oxygen interacting with, ammonia. All right. So we start getting different molecules starting to interact. Notice we're getting more and more complex, bigger and bigger molecules here, and we start to have interactions between these ones. We start forming what we call intermolecular bonds between different molecules. All right, and they start kind of connecting together. Now, every time we form one of these bonds, this is very important. Every time we form, whether it's going between atoms to make molecules, or molecules together to make a larger molecule, every time we do that, we need energy in to make that bond. The energy into the bond. All right, we need to put energy in. In this case, we think in early Earth, it could have been caused by all kinds of stuff. Volcanic eruptions causing a lot of heat. We think it could have been. We think the atmosphere was very, very, very violent, like planet-wide thunderstorms in this early planet here. All right, so we start creating these larger and larger molecules. Right. Or another way for to word large molecule would be a macromolecule. So shows like a square with a big M. All right, so we go from atoms to molecules to making molecules or macromolecules, and we're always adding energy to do this. All right, so we're adding energy to make these to go in together to get bigger and bigger molecules. So now we have these macromolecules, and they can start working together, and they can make even bigger and bigger ones as we keep going. All right. Now, another name that we would put for these here, this macromolecule is a large molecule made up of many parts. So a more generic chemistry term that we use for a macromolecule, even more generic, I should say, is we could call this a polymer. In chemistry, a polymer is anything that's made up of other parts, all right, where you combine different things to make something. All right. It's because it's made of many parts. All right. Poly means multiple. All right. Well, which means macromolecule is made up of many parts. Those parts are being molecules. So it's actually, this would be called a monomer. Mono meaning one. All right. I put a bunch of individual molecules together, monomers, to create a polymer. All right. And we start seeing this when we start talking about the chemistry of biology here, is where we have different monomers that make up our macromolecules that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so let's go ahead and start applying this into what we're going to be talking about here. So let's shift this over here. Let's go for a lift. All right, let's adjust this camera a little bit. Okay, so still thinking about what we just did. Went from atoms to molecules to macromolecules. Okay, so now we're going to actually apply it a little bit more, just to go do that same thing, a little bit more specific. Okay, so instead of atoms, we're going to be more specific. We're really talking about a couple fundamental atoms here. We're talking about carbon, talking about hydrogens, talking about oxygens, talking about nitrogens. All right, so we have our fundamental atoms here. All right, they can kind of come together to start forming our fundamental or basic molecules. Things like carbon dioxide. All right, so we put in energy between a carbon and two oxygens. They form those bonds, and now we have a molecule. talk about water. We talk about ammonia and carbon dioxide. Methane, hydrogen gas, oxygen gas. So we're creating all these different molecules. All right. And in some of the more experiments, as we started kind of trying to figure out how this could have happened, how could we create potentially the first building blocks of like these molecules and macromolecules that are necessary for all cells to exist. All right. We start kind of putting in situations and see kind of what happens every time. All right, we start putting them together and we start combining these molecules together. Now, this is where it can get a little bit different. How you arrange these molecules together is going to kind of determine its different paths. All right, so let's say, for example, let's just start kind of one when the Miller-Urey experiment. They tried to combine them in certain circumstances, and they built so we went from atoms to molecules to a macro, or we start building macromolecule. The molecule they're making here, they're starting to combine these together, and they start creating what are called amino acids. All right, so we start combining these together, and we build something called an amino acid. All right, I'm going to abbreviate just AA, but it's spelled amino acid. All right, amino acids are complex. They have a central carbon, and then they have a carboxylic group attached to it, methane attached to the top. On our group, a amine group attached to our amino. So it's kind of like we're starting to put different molecules together to create amino acids. And then we could take many of these amino acids all right, and we could start putting those bonds together. All right, and when we start putting those things together, all right, what we've built here is a protein. All right, so what we have over here then is a protein. All right, which is a type of macromolecule. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken atoms to build molecules, taken those molecules and made amino acids, which is kind of a larger molecule. All right, and then I combine those larger molecules together. Again, energy's coming in to form these bonds. All right, energy's coming in. All right, and actually in this reaction here is what we call a dehydration synthesis. So when we do that, not only is the energy going in, all right, it releases water. That's called dehydration synthesis. All right, and it creates a protein. All right, these proteins is what we call, or is a macromolecule. It's a fundamental molecule for all living things. It's a macromolecule. So we went, and this would be here, in this case would be a polymer. So think about what we just talked about. Polymers are made up of monomers, all right? So if a protein is a polymer, what is the monomer? The thing that makes it up is, in this case, for a protein, all right, the amino acid. In this case, the amino acid is the monomer. All right? Now, this idea of going from atoms, creating molecules, to creating monomers, amino acids in this case, to creating polymers, in this case a protein, right? It can be applied in different ways. So I did in this case with the proteins. We'll talk about this year about how We can take this path. If they're combined a little bit different, it creates a different type of, monomer called a nucleotide. And then we combine, that's a monomer, and we combine different nucleotides together. We combine those nucleotides together, and when we get that, we get a different type of. All right, so it's nucleotide. We get those together and we create a different kind of macromolecule. In this case, it's called a nucleic acid, which are very, very important for things, molecules like DNA and RNA. All right, it's a type of nucleic acid. All right, we could do it down here for talking about monosaccharides. It's the monomer to create carbohydrates, and fatty acids are the monomers to create lipids. I'm not as concerned about knowing those combinations right now because you're going to be doing that in the next lesson. All right. Big picture, what we're talking about right now. This video is going a little long, I understand. As we went from atoms, very simple, to building molecules, to building monomers. In this case, the example I did, the monomer is called the amino acid. And then we took the monomer to create a polymer. In this case, if the monomer is amino acids, the polymer is going to be a protein. All right. Like I did the example up here, I use atoms to make molecules, molecules together to make nucleotides, and then nucleotides together to make a nucleic acid. Things like nucleic acids and proteins and lipids and carbohydrates are all extremely important to create things like organelles and eventually cells to do more complex things to eventually have life. So we're not even talking about living things yet. We're talking about the necessary molecules. In one of your future lessons, we're going to start talking about what are the 4 macromolecules necessary for life. We'll talk about some of their functions in more detail. The big picture right now is talking about how do atoms build to molecules, into monomers, into macromolecules. All right. So I think that's what we want to hit. We want to talk a little bit about that idea of we're building, we're making more. Use that Lego analogy. All right. Individual Legos to make something small, to make something bigger, to create something even bigger. Every time we're adding these, making more bonds and combining these things, right? We're putting energy in to do that. All right. If you're not sure about this, you can watch it again. Or if you're really still stuck, don't ever hesitate to contact me. This is a tougher topic, so especially because of all the chemistry. Don't hesitate to email me or send me a message on Remind. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and good luck, and may the science be with you.